Does it matter which day I keep?
It does matter. But people may disagree.
One day of the week was chosen by God as a day of rest. Does it matter which day this is? Sunday, Wednesday, Tuesday, etc.
Throughout the Bible, there is overwhelming evidence that God's day of rest is the Sabbath, or Saturday.
But this truth can be difficult to see if we simply zoom in on a few isolated verses. There are some passages which, when taken in isolation, may bring confusion. These passages may seem to suggest different truth about God's holy day. Let's do the following. Let's give these verses the benefit of the doubt. Let's examine them.
Can they prove that it doesn't matter which day you keep?
Passage number 1.
Who are you, to judge another's servant? One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. He who observes the day, observes it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day, to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord. And he who does not eat, to the Lord, he does not eat.
But Romans chapter 14, verses 4 to 6, doesn't mention rest or Sabbath. This passage doesn't concern rest or Sabbath at all.
It speaks about observing a day.
What day?
Taken in isolation, this passage is inconclusive. It speaks about observing a day, but it is unclear as to why. Notice that Romans 14 deals with food and fasting throughout the chapter.
We can therefore state that
It can be argued.
The passage is about days of fasting.
At this time period, the new Christians were pressured by Jews to observe the old temple customs. Feasts were such customs.
Feasts had days of fasting. They were counted as special days on the calendar.
Apostle Paul doesn't question the Sabbath in this text. Back then, everyone kept it. The problem of their day was Old Temple mentality, and Old Temple traditions, not the Sabbath. We need to ensure not to take this verse out of its historical context. Let's allow the Bible to give us the message it's intended to convey.
In conclusion, Romans chapter 14, verses 4 to 6, deals with Old Temple feasts, not the weekly Sabbath.
Passage number 2.
Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. So let no one judge you in food, or in drink, or regarding a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ.
You observe days, and months, and times, and years.
In the Old Testament, many holidays were Sabbaths.
They fell on different weekdays each year.
Here is one example.
The first day of the 7th month was a Sabbath rest. The 10th day of the 7th month was also a Sabbath rest.
Sabbaths fell on different weekdays each year.
Another example, this month. Day 1 is a holiday Sabbath. And day 7 is again a holiday Sabbath.
Again, they cannot both fall on a Saturday.
This means, there are two types of Sabbaths.
Saturdays and shadow, or ceremonial, Sabbaths. Two types of Sabbaths.
Examine this diagram.
On the right is the feast Sabbath. It is part of the law of Moses. It is a shadow.
On the left is the weekly Sabbath, or Saturday. It is part of God's law, and stands forever.
The two types of Sabbaths are confirmed in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 37 and 38.
These are the feasts of the Lord.
Besides,
The Sabbaths of the Lord. Feast Sabbaths is not the same as the Sabbaths of the Lord.
the Lord's Sabbath takes place only on Saturdays.
Leviticus chapter 23, verses 37 and 38, lists both the shadow Sabbaths and the Lord's Sabbaths in the same passage.
It makes distinction between the two.
The sacrifices and holidays were shadows and ended at the cross of Jesus. They ended, because Jesus fulfilled them on the cross. He was the true sacrifice for sin.
The Sabbath of the Lord stands forever. But the sacrifices and holidays were shadows indeed. They had to end. The Sabbath still applies. Only the shadows were nailed on the cross. From the cross onwards, there is no more need of animal sacrifices.
But the Lord's Sabbath remains. It is not a shadow, it is part of the Ten Commandments, written in stone by the finger of God.
In conclusion, these verses in Colossians and Galatians deal with all temple holidays, not the weekly Sabbath.
Passages number 3.
Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments, contained in ordinances. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross.
The sanctuary laws were temporary. They are the ceremonial laws.
But the moral law, the Ten Commandments, also known as God's law, are eternal. Ask any pastor if the Ten Commandments are still binding. Surely, the answer is yes. Some say, except for one.
Why are 9 of them binding, but only the Sabbath is not?
The fourth commandment begins with the words, "Remember to keep the Sabbath holy."
Should we then forget about it?
God proclaimed the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai with a thunder before a national assembly. If God ever abolished one jot of it, wouldn't he proclaim that change throughout the New Testament?
But no such change was ever made. Search the New Testament for yourself.
On the contrary, we have every indication that the first Christians, being mostly Jewish converts, kept the Sabbath.
Some say, Jesus abolished the law, as he gave us new rest.
Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
But Jesus himself had a custom to go to the synagogue each Sabbath. If we are followers of Jesus, we should keep the Sabbath too.
He said, "Truly I say to you, that as long as heaven and earth exist, neither a jot, nor even the smallest stroke of a pen, will be erased from the law, until it all be fulfilled."
In conclusion, only the shadow Sabbaths, months, costumes, and animal sacrifices were nailed to the cross. They are the ceremonial law.
This is what Ephesians chapter 2, and Colossians chapter 2, are about.
Passages number 4.
Wherefore, my sentence is, that we trouble not them, which, from among the Gentiles, are turned to God. But that we write unto them, that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. The first Christians were almost exclusively Jews. All the apostles were Jews. They kept the Sabbath, as the Bible said.
The newly baptized Gentile Christians also kept the Sabbath. Keep watching to find out more.
They kept it, under most dire and forbidding circumstances. Back then, Christianity was not so widespread. Back then, becoming a Christian meant a prison sentence for many. Many became martyrs.
Compared to our day,
Christianity is everywhere. Thankfully, there is still no persecution. The Bible is sold in dollar stores. And the gospel is preached through books, in churches, on TV, and on the internet.
If the first Christians kept the Sabbath, how much more should we keep it in this age of peace and enlightenment?
In conclusion, Acts chapter 15 and 20 do not mention the Sabbath, because back then all Christians kept it.
Point number 5. Let's also consider this claim.
The Sabbath commandment is the only one not reiterated in the New Testament.
Is this the case? Here are 7 verses from the New Testament.
Jesus said, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter, or on the Sabbath."
Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for man."
Jesus came to Nazareth. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day.
And the disciples rested on the Sabbath, according to the commandment.
The Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath.
Apostle Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath.
There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God.
In conclusion, was the Sabbath reiterated in the New Testament?
Most certainly. Many texts are there to prove it.
Point number 6.
Let's also consider this claim.
In the New Testament, if a Sabbath meeting is mentioned, it is a Jewish meeting, and not Christian.
Is this the case? Here are 2 examples.
The Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath.
And on the Sabbath, Lydia, a seller of purple, of the city of Thyatira, attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul.
First, this meeting was not in a synagogue. Second, Lydia was from the city of Thyatira and likely not Jewish.
In conclusion, did Gentile Christians hold meetings on Sabbath?
Most certainly. We have at least 2 texts that prove it.
Point number 7.
Let's also consider this claim.
No one kept the Sabbath prior to Moses.
Is this the case? Read Genesis chapter 2.
After creation, God rested on the 7th day, and sanctified it. This is recorded, both in Genesis chapter 2, and in the text of the 4th commandment.
God did not rest due to fatigue or tiredness. He set an example for all mankind.
Man and woman were also made during creation week. We still need both men and women. We still need the Sabbath.
Our workers and animals still need a day of rest, the Sabbath.
God's commandments are binding since creation. The Lord told Noah to take 7 of each clean animal, both male and female, into the ark.
The Bible tells us that Abraham obeyed God's commandments and his laws.
Long before Moses, God had priests who offered his sacrifices. Melchizedek was one such priest.
Another example, Pharaoh confronted Moses, that he tells people to rest. He was telling them to Shabbath. He was telling them to keep the Sabbath.
When Israel received the manna, God asked Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my laws?" This took place before the law was proclaimed from Mount Sinai. In conclusion, did the people of God keep the Sabbath prior to Moses?
Most certainly. God rested on the Sabbath, and set an example for all.
Point number 8.
There are other, minor arguments, questioning the Sabbath. They involve verses, taken in isolation, or try to place Jesus against God's law. But Jesus kept his Father's commandments. And all other minor points are resolved by the main ones, which we listed above.
Point number 9. Warning. Apostle Peter warns us not to be carried away by the error of unprincipled or lawless men. He tells us that some teachings of Apostle Paul are difficult to understand. The message of Apostle Paul is grace. We should be on guard while accepting grace, not to be carried away into lawlessness.
Number 10. Summary.
To summarize, does it matter which day I keep? The Bible is clear, yes, it matters. We should keep Saturday holy, because the Sabbath commandment is still binding.
The Apostle Paul concludes, therefore, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God.
The first Christians kept the Sabbath. Throughout the Dark Ages, faithful Bible believers also kept the Sabbath. Then, the Reformation came.
And now, in the age of enlightenment, many Protestants have rediscovered the Sabbath, and have become Sabbath keepers.
And friends, please note, the Sabbath does not point to Jesus. It is not part of the plan of redemption. It was given at creation, before sin. It is eternal. The old temple is part of redemption. It pointed to Jesus. It ended on the cross. Therefore, old temple customs are temporary. The Sabbath is eternal. Let's not confuse the 10 Commandments with circumcision, feasts, weekday holidays and animal sacrifices. Those were shadows of Christ, but the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, stands forever.